Hello, everyone, and welcome to the May 2022 Legacies and Lunch, a program of CAL's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Register Zabindin, Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library houses the galleries and bookstore at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. The Roberts Library Research Room is open Tuesday through Friday from 10 to 5, and you can join us now every Saturday, noon until 4, for genealogy and manuscript research. This talk is being live streamed to YouTube and will be available to view on CAL's YouTube channel immediately following the program. It is also being closed captioned. The speaker will answer questions at the end of the session, so please type your questions in the chat box on Zoom. And now for today's program. This month, we have Buckley Foster to talk about John Wesley Woodward, founder of the first school for the deaf in Arkansas. Buck is a lecturer at the University of Central Arkansas in Conway, teaching classes in American military history, the Old South, the American Civil War, the Vietnam War, Arkansas history, and the history of hunting and fishing. He is currently researching the end of market hunting and the rise of sportsmen in Arkansas. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Buck.
Thank you, Heather. Hopefully you can hear me now. All righty, good deal. I appreciate it. Appreciate everybody tuning in. This may go a little bit long, so I apologize right up front with that. But John Wesley Woodward was a very interesting person. As you can see, he's got a long list of qualities and long list of monikers, if you will. Unfortunately, we don't have any pictures or paintings of John Woodward. There was a house fire some years later, and we believe that most of his possessions were destroyed during that time period. He was born on a plantation near Richmond, Virginia. Let me try to advance this here. There we go. Born on a plantation near Richmond, Virginia in 1820 to Dr. James Woodward. We believe that his mother's name was Virginia also. He contracted scarlet fever around the age of 3, and this illness caused his hearing loss. Several sources indicate that he was orphaned around the age of 10 years old, but of course they quote each other as their source, so it's not really clear. But we do know that as a child, his uncle is caring for him. And because very few schools existed in the United States for the education of the deaf, his uncle sent him across the Atlantic to school. In 1832, young Woodward arrived in France for an education. He was only 12 years old. Most likely, he attended the National Institute for the Deaf in Paris, the world's first public deaf school. During his education, he learned to read and write at least 2 and possibly more languages. He read lips, and those who met him claimed he was so proficient at lip reading that most people did not realize that he was deaf. After arriving back in the United States, after his education, he traveled. Exactly where he went and what he did is not clear, but we do know that he did arrive in Arkansas around 1845. Some stories say that Clarksville resident Augustus Ward contacted him to come and teach deaf children in Johnson County, and other stories say that Ward met Woodward on the streets of Clarksville, and after learning that the man was deaf, asked him to come and teach school at his home. One of these stories may be true, or it may be some other connection, but Woodward did come to know Ward, and he did move to Clarksville. In the first Johnson County courthouse, Woodward became assistant to Mr. Ward, who was the Johnson County clerk. Ward had started a blind school in 1849, so he may have recruited Woodward to add deaf school to it. It is possible that Woodward lived in Mr. Ward's home for a while as well. On May 1st, 1851, Ward and Woodward started the first deaf-mute school in the state of Arkansas in Ward's home. In a Little Rock newspaper, they posted, quote, "The trustees of the Clarksville Institute have made arrangements to have a class of deaf mutes taught. The School of Mutes will open on the 1st of May, tuition gratis. Boarding can be had at a very reasonable rate. Only a limited number of pupils, 6 or 8, will be taken. Persons wishing to send may know more by addressing the trustees of the Clarksville Institute, Johnson County, Arkansas. Applications must be made soon." Woodward, using the education he obtained in Paris, taught those classes. Ward worked to recruit students to the school, which contained 5 during the first year. Both men solicited funding from the Arkansas State Legislature, and although the legislature did ultimately send $300 to the school, the amount was not enough to keep the school open. Woodward, who was educated at the free school in Paris, refused to charge tuition. While in Clarksville, Woodward became more involved in the Arkansas Democratic Party. We can see an open letter from citizens of Johnson County to the United States Senator Solon Borland, which Woodward signed, asking Borland to attend a picnic in honor of his service to the Mexican-American War and the United States Senate. Woodward also married Virginia Cox, one of 2 orphaned sisters whom Mr. Ward had taken in several years earlier. Over a decade later, state legislatures created a deaf-mute institute located in Little Rock. Virginia Woodward was appointed its first matron. The Woodward Club is the name of the Boys Honor Society at the Deaf-Mute Institute. By 1852, Woodward, although still a resident of Clarksville and assistant Johnson County clerk, obtained an additional job in Little Rock. He served as an enrolling clerk of the Arkansas House of Representatives. So what are the duties of an enrolling clerk? Well, an enrolling clerk, as you can see, prepares messages to the Senate involving passed legislation. The clerk is responsible for the official accounting of proceedings. Basically, he keeps official records. 4 years later, Woodward is still the enrolling clerk for the House. Again, Woodward continues to get more deeply involved in Arkansas politics. As we can see from this snappy announcement, Woodward took over editing the True Democrat when the editor Richard Johnson became state treasurer. Woodward had temporarily taken over the year before, but only briefly. As I said, he was heavily involved in Arkansas politics, and he had gathered several adversaries during his time in Little Rock. So as we move closer to the outbreak of the American Civil War, Woodward is editing the True Democrat. He is for secession when the issue is discussed. He and Virginia are now living in Little Rock full-time. The True Democrat is the paper of the family. For those who are unfamiliar with the family or the dynasty, the term refers to the Conways, Seviers, and Johnson families who controlled Arkansas politics for decades from the territorial period to the Civil War. When Democratic factions split in 1858, the family had called themselves the True Democrats, and the opposition had called themselves the Old Line Democrats. C.C. Danley, the owner and editor of the Arkansas Gazette and member of the Know Nothing Party, hated the True Democrat, the family, and by extension, Woodward. The 2 papers and editors often dueled in the pages of their 2 publications. Know Nothings were a nativist party that opposed immigrants, but especially Catholics, like the Irish Catholics. It became the main alternative to the Democratic Party in several states. In one of his attacks, Danley claimed that Woodward had prostituted his principles to work for the True Democrat. Quote, "He is a sprightly writer of facile antecedents, uncertain status, elastic conscience, and marketable principles." Danley and Woodward mainly argued over public printing. In February 1859, the Gazette printed that the True Democrat had received $39,000 over the last 3 years for printing services for the state government. Danley attacked Woodward, saying the only reason he was a true Democrat was to allow Richard Johnson to run for governor. Mississippian Thomas Hindman arrived in Helena in 1854 to practice law. He challenged the Know-Nothings in the state, and that earned him an 1858 seat as a United States Senator from northern Arkansas. But Hindman wanted the Senate seat that the family controlled, and that caused him to break with the family. His side, the old line Democrats, went back and forth with the true Democrats, and Woodward was in the center of that fight as the co-editor of the family newspaper. Hindman announced that he would stump around the state, building up his own reputation by destroying the family's standings. A series of letters began to arrive at various newspapers across the state, mainly in the old line Democrat papers, praising Hindman for his ability to speak and for wonderful ideas for the state. Basically, what we call today a fluff piece. These letters to the editor were signed by the name Viator. Woodward and others claimed that Viator was fiction and was obviously some sort of ploy to make Hindman look good. Woodward even hinted that he thought Hindman's secretary was the author. Hindman rebuffed the accusations, saying that Woodward actually wrote the letters as some sort of trap or trick against the old line Democrats. Editor of the Arkansian, Elias Boutonnot, defended Woodward in 1859. Boutonnot basically said that instead of challenging Woodward's ideas in a gentlemanly fashion with honor and professionalism, anyone who disagreed with Woodward made fun of him personally. This article is in response to Woodward's showdown with Hindman and his supporters over the Viator letters. A follow-up to the previous article came in August 12, 1859. Woodward challenged both the opposing Democrats and the Know-Nothings in Arkansas. Boutonnot says opponents attacked Woodward because they were afraid of his logic and reasoning and have to resort to what's called, quote, blackguarding, which means to attack someone personally with abuse and scurrilous language. Woodward defends himself against the accusations and the fight against Hindman and his supporters in another article. Hindman had a lackey named Martin who confessed that he was the one who wrote the letters, but it later came out that Hindman himself had written the Viator letters. When the Civil War did break out, Woodward was playing Judge David Walker, a leading Whig in Northwest Arkansas, in a game of chess through the mail. Walker later became president of the Arkansas Secession Convention, even though he had initially opposed calling the convention. Observers considered Woodward a chess master and called him the Paul Morphy of Arkansas. Morphy was an American chess player at that time. He is considered to have been the greatest chess master of his era. It is often considered the unofficial world chess champion. When Arkansas seceded, lawmakers created a new Arkansas Constitution. Because of his penmanship and previous experience, the legislature chose Woodward as the scribe, and he penned the 1861 Arkansas State Constitution, which you can see there to the right. By 1862, the Union Army was marching unopposed in northern Arkansas. Batesville and Searcy were in federal hands. Most of the regular Confederate units in Arkansas had crossed over the Mississippi River. By May, rumors swirled Little Rock would fall. A witness noted that, quote, people are frightened out of their wits. Arkansas Governor Henry Rector was one of those who was frightened. Instead of making carefully planned instructions for the evacuation of the capital city, he panicked. He had made plans several months before concerning the removal of government documents. As we're looking at these slides, these are actual drawings that Woodward made on his trip. You'll It'll become clear here in a moment, but these are all hand-drawn that Woodward had done. The governor envisioned a line of wagons laden with papers heading to Washington in far southwestern Arkansas. But there was a problem. It had been raining for most of the spring, and nearly every creek was out of its banks. The fast steamboat called the Little Rock had just arrived, and he decided to load the records onto the steamboat, take them to Washington via water. But to do this, the boat would have to go down the Arkansas River, the Mississippi River, up the Red River, and then go by wagon the rest of the way to Washington. Of course, a terrible risk. The Mississippi had federal gunboats everywhere. After considerable deliberation, he decided to send the records to Hot Springs, his hometown, but you can't get to Hot Springs via steamboat. So a plan was created to send the papers via steamboat to Dardanelle and then transport all the records via wagon overland through the Ouachita Mountains to Hot Springs. By May 1862, Woodward was chief clerk of the state auditor's office. Rector tapped Woodward with the difficult task to move those records. Woodward obtained some lumber and oversaw the construction of several large packing crates. He stuffed them full of thousands of state and Pulaski County records. One source noted that the estimated total weight at somewhere between 15 and 18,000 pounds of records. Woodward had all the records loaded onto the steamboat and were underway within a little more than 24 hours of the governor's orders. When the crates were unloaded in Dardanelle, Woodward and his men had 50 miles to cover through the Ouachita Mountains, a monumental task in 1862. Rain fell and continued to fall. Some wagons had covers and others did not. Boxes were rained upon day after day. After weeks of exhausting efforts, most of the wagons arrived in Hot Springs. Some of the records were stored in the Planters Hotel, while others were hidden further up the road. But the Federal troops didn't show up so quickly in Little Rock. Confederate troops from Texas began to arrive in Little Rock instead. But there was no real danger, and Rector began to look more and more like a fool. Later in the fall of 1863, when there was real danger for the records, Woodward, under the direction of a new governor, Flanagan, set about moving the records to Washington. In November of 1862, Woodward is still listed as an enrolling secretary in the Arkansas Confederate state government. A Washington, Arkansas newspaper reports that Woodward is there and has delivered a copy of the Ordinance of Secession. The idea to collect military records and other wartime documents created a push for a state historical society. In the Arkansas Gazette office, the organization was born. One of the organization's vice presidents was John W. Woodward. They were expected to write papers related to Arkansas history and gather material, but the organization did not survive the war. Woodward will eventually write an article on Colonel Matthew Lyon, who actually set up a business trading post here in Clarksville. Well, it's actually Spadra, but to trade with the Cherokee. By September of 1863, part of the government has now moved to Washington, Arkansas, meaning the state government. Woodward wrote a magazine article that was published, and as I said about Colonel Matthew Lyon, he was offered quite a bit of money. He had actually written it for the Arkansas Historical Society, but as that organization began to fall apart, he was offered quite a bit of money to publish it elsewhere, and he sold it for publication instead. He also wrote many poems, many of them nationally known. and nationally published. Some of them, it was said, I haven't really been able to track it down, but it was said that he won awards for some of those poems, especially the one about Virginia. But I have seen there are some publications of a few of his poems that are floating around. Um, he wrote under the pen name, a couple of different pen names, Tetotet and Tototo. Not really sure. There's really no explanation why he wrote under those, other than he had some political enemies that as we have already discussed or mentioned, and possibly that he thought that might be damaging to getting his things published. It's not clear, but the most famous, of course, are listed here as most famous poems. Um, One called "The Legend of the Broken Sword," which covers Hernando de Soto. Um, One called Virginia, which was about his home state, but also about his mother and coincidentally his wife, all have the same name. And then another poem that was called Freedom and Right, which was inspired by the Civil War. I have not been able to track that one down. I do have been able to track down the Spatter poem. But a poet as well. Woodward died February 20th, 1865, not in battle. It's not really clear, probably pneumonia. Uh, but he was buried at Mount Holly Cemetery in Little Rock. If you're familiar with Arkansas history whatsoever, and around Little Rock, that's where, the big names are buried. And he was buried there. Um, the tributes poured in. They called him a remarkable man. He was a remarkable man, a mental and psychological phenomenon. In April 1924, a relative brought his body back to Clarksville to be buried with his wife. And you can see that his stone, actually, last time I was out there, the stone had come off the base, which we've got to get that repaired. But it's there in Clarksville. November 5th, 1936, the Centennial Commission of Arkansas placed the historical marker on the site of the school in his in here. It's right next to where Mr. Mr. Ward's home sat, where the University of the Ozarks is presently located. At his death, his estate had a listing of his possessions. It contained nearly 500 books and magazines, including works by Milton, Byron, the London News, treatises on economics, penal codes of Europe, Bailey's Algebra, and the history of England. So a very interesting reading, and we read everything. If you take a look over to the right-hand side and look at this article that has been published, basically almost a eulogy, you can see here that Woodward was very much in the belief that Shakespeare was not one individual. The author of this article says that um, Woodward believed that Bacon and a clique of intelligent contemporaries had put all these Shakespeare plays on stage through the agency of William Shakespeare, who was a dull and stupid stage manager. So he had a lot of thoughts on a lot of different things, that's for sure. So I guess we can wrap it up and have an opportunity to have some questions. John Woodward was a savant, an author, a poet, an artist, a teacher, a chess master, an associate editor, a letterer, wagon master, Johnson County assistant clerk, Arkansas House of Representatives enrolling clerk, and 1861 Arkansas State Constitution Convention scribe. But he was also my third great grandfather. Right. Let's see if there are some questions.
Okay. Buck, if you want to turn your camera back on.
Okay.
Mark Christ would like to know, is there an Encyclopedia of Arkansas entry on Woodward? And if so, if not, that you should write one. So he just typed that in, and so I haven't gotten to go and look yet. But do you know if he has an entry in the encyclopedia?
He does not. Has asked me to do that, and I told him that I would. So it's not there yet, but we're going to get that done.
Well, I mean, he was a remarkable person. I really am impressed with, everything that he was able to accomplish in his life. I told you before we got started, both my parents are blind, and so I always find it fascinating when somebody in a time, you know, like Woodward. I mean, the fact that he was able to do as many things as he was able to do with a disability is really incredible. Um, and if people didn't realize he was deaf because he read lips so well, then that may have been his superpower for sure.
Definitely was involved, and the thing is when I began to kind of dig into him, I mean, it was like every time you turned up something, it was something new he was involved in. He was very, I mean, he gotten so much involved in politics, and very much a supporter of the family, um, very much involved in that. And I think that um, may be indicative of where he was from. I mean, he grew up on a plantation in Virginia. That's how his family ended up with the wealth, I believe. We can hypothesize that. I don't have exactly information on that, but um, it's I don't. We can't really excuse. It's just part of him. Roy Miller was talking about, maybe we can excuse his pro-slavery views. I mean, it's just part of it. We don't have to excuse it. We can just say, that's part of his life, and that's part of where he stood for. It also helps us understand what he's standing for and why he's doing what he's doing. And I mean, he firmly believes in secession, and he's involved in supporting the Confederacy. And I guarantee you, if he was not deaf, he would have carried a weapon in order to go off to war to defend those rights, what he believed is rights, the way it looks like. Um, but so very much involved in so many different things, and then them tasking him with these big projects. It's can you imagine trying to carry 20,000 pounds worth of papers in 1862, 63 across the Arkansas countryside when there's the roads are non-existent basically. So um, I see a question that says, how did I go about finding his poetry? I want the Virginia poet, the Virginia, I think, and the other, it just was luck. It's been a while since I found it, but it was actually published in a book of poetry. The Spadra one was, and the Virginia one was. They made reference to that he was the author of Virginia, and this was a different poem by him. So it was just pure luck. Running across that, I mean, it took a while to kind of dig, but just lots of digging. I wish I could find others. I know there's a lot of others. Um, I have to, guess, thank or commend Russell Baker for putting me on to the drawings. He did a talk several years ago, maybe 20 years ago, during the about the Constitution and Woodward carrying away the papers, and he turned me on to the drawings that Woodward did. So I got to appreciate. I had to throw a shout out to Russell Baker for that.
Well, I think that, finding stuff in some ways has gotten easier, in some ways has gotten harder with places digitizing stuff, you can easily do a search sometimes and find things. And you have those, you have those lucky days. You have those days where you find something. And if you're like me, it's often when I'm not looking for that, I find it. If I went searching for it, I wouldn't. But so he was, you're related to him, and you heard Russell Baker talk about him, and so you just started piecing together all of the little details, and the fact that you've come up with as much as, I mean, it's interesting, it's incredible.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most important things that allows us to even follow his line is because he did work in a newspaper, and and involved in Little Rock politics at a very volatile time, and had being in that mix, his name kept popping up, depending on which side you're on, as the hero or the villain, and um, then I have to go back to Baker on the Constitution. He discovered that when he said he found the Constitution. It had been lost. The original had been lost or misplaced, or however you want to say it. And in the archives, they found it, and then he looked and saw how it was written. And there, when Woodward writes the word "and," A-N-D, he takes the D, when he makes the D like a squirrel, and then he swirls it up almost like a at,
Uh-huh.
and he circles the and. A-N-D, and the D circles the and. And Russell said, I know, I've seen writing like that before. I know somebody who writes like that. And he went and looked, and he cross-checked it. He looked at all the writing, and discovered that it was Woodward.
Yes.
And then I was able to find the information that allowed us to know that he was the author. So he wrote it.
That's
the scribe, I should say. What's interesting to me is he is the scribe. He is taking that down, and he is deaf.
Mm-hmm.
That's just, I don't.
So he's having to look at
how that works
while he's writing. Like, I mean, we get used to being able to look at our. Yeah, he's looked. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's reading lips and writing it down.
Very
but
nice.
It's and I mean, we can go and view. I mean, it's in the archive. It's in the Arkansas State Archives. We can go and view that Constitution, and you can go and take a look at it. I do not have any evidence that he used sign language, but that would be almost impossible to verify.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we have American Sign Language, and I have never looked to see when that was developed.
Mm-hmm.
But he was educated in France, and the French school had been around since the 18th century, the free school for the deaf. It was a very prestigious school, and still exists. It's still there today. Been around a really long time, and so it wouldn't have been American Sign Language for sure.
I was going to Google American Sign Language because I don't know that it's that old.
I don't think it is either.
I
think that is a more modern.
I think Braille is older than sign language.
You're welcome. Thank you for everybody. I can't see how many people are here, but thank everybody for coming and listening.
Well, American Sign Language originated in the early 19th century at the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut.
But it doesn't give us a date.
Doesn't give us a date.
Early.
Yes.
But being educated in France, I'm guessing that he would not have.
Yeah, no.
But it's also something he might have picked up if he'd have been, if it had been available. But, his wife went on. I mentioned she was the matron at the Little Rock, and she was there until she basically retired. She stayed there on after his death. And I don't know the year. I mean, I have it written down somewhere, but she eventually came back to Clarksville. And that's when her home burned.
The school in Little Rock, the deaf school in Little Rock, when was it built?
It was post-Civil War.
Yes. Okay. because I know the blind school side of it, there's the old Confederates home is one of the buildings there. And Parnell Hall, I think is on the deaf school side is, or maybe it's Purnell Hall, but it's on the National Register. Mark Christ has a question. Do you recall the title you had for this presentation when you were going to give it to the AHA?
Yeah, it was basically that first slide, which is that really long, John Wesley Woodward savant, so on and so on and so on. It was that big old long thing. That was it. The very first slide of the presentation.
Well, thank you so much for doing this for us. It has been so interesting and so enlightening, and I love that you were able to piece stuff together, because that is truly it's the most important thing. It's what we do as historians, right? We're piecing little bits of pieces together, and you never know where you're going to find it. So thank you, and we look forward to reading your article, your entry for the encyclopedia. No rush, no hurry.
Sure. Well,
finish your book first. You've got a new book coming out.
Hopefully. We've got folks also that I've been contacted over time, once people kind of realized, I was working on this. We've got folks working on trying to get more information about deaf schools in the United States. There's a PhD working on getting a marker for every single first school in every state.
Oh, that's great.
They contacted me 2 years ago, I guess, and then of course during the pandemic and everything fell apart. But there's folks still working on this behind the lines, outside of this little small area here in Arkansas. So,
Sabrina McPherson or McPherson, I'm not sure which way it's pronounced, but she says a disability history of the United States has lots of information, especially on sign language and Braille. So sign language was long before Braille. Sorry, my parents are both blind, so I do the blind side of things. I don't necessarily do the deaf side.
One of the things we might have missed is, Ward started a blind school several years before he started trying to get the deaf school going. Matter of fact, if you look back at that little advertisement, it says the Reverend so-and-so is no longer affiliated with us. He had a Reverend that came in and was trying to teach the blind school when they shut that one down and started the deaf school. Very interesting. Yeah. But there's also a school that's attempted to be started in Fort Smith, not long after, and then there's another one that was attempted to be started somewhere else, and I can't remember. But the Arkansas State Legislature, when the monetary support started, that's when the foundation, when we got $300 sent to Clarksville, that was it. That just wasn't enough.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you again for doing this. We appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
I want to tell everybody to join us next month to see Pete Daniel talk about his forthcoming title, Curating the American Past, a memoir of a quarter century at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. That'll be Wednesday, June 1st. And Pete is one of my all-time favorite speakers. So please join us. We'll be back here on Zoom. So thank you again, Buck. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Everybody have a good day.